Hello and welcome to episode 27 of the Insider's Guide to Project Cars 2, where today we are going to be taking a look at LiveTrack evolution and continuing our look into the LiveTrack and weather systems. Now, in the previous episode we were taking a look at basically the whole LiveTrack and weather seeding, which is all about how LiveTrack is set up at the very beginning of your first session. But with this evolution episode we're going to be taking a look at basically how LiveTrack will progress over time, what kind of factors affect LiveTrack and influences basically all the various different parameters of it, and you'll be able to see visually, and I'll talk about in detail how stuff evolves over time throughout the basically the session's progress of either your practice, your qualifying, or your race session. So we have this scenario set up here where we're at the Brands Hatch Indy circuit, so the laps are nice and short, so we should see some pretty good and quick progression rates. We're starting off with rain, weather conditions, we're then going to advance into overcast, followed by heavy cloud, and then we're going to go into medium cloud, and then depending on how long it takes for me to showcase all this stuff and talk about it and how long the episode is, we may end up going back round to the rain conditions later. Now, don't worry, I do have the weather conditions accelerated. It's not going to be the whole real-time weather. I believe it's set to 5 times weather acceleration, so we should basically see the weather transition quite nicely throughout the duration of this episode. Now we are in the dev build once again, so we're just going to kick this session off, and what we're going to do is park the car over to the right hand side of the circuit here. We're going to pop ourselves into the free cam, and then we are going to go ahead and move ourselves around the circuit and basically take a look at how LiveTrack is going to progress as these cars are driving around the circuit. So one thing that we should probably note straight away is, as the cars go up the hill, is obviously although the track is raining, the track is pretty well saturated. We've got a quite nice big LiveTrack pedal here, but you could also see a little bit of a drying line starting to form as the cars are going around the circuit. Now, as obviously the rain is continuing to fall, that drying line is starting to disappear. Now, something else that you may have seen as the cars went through turn 1 earlier is a bit of a dirty line started to appear over on the inside of the racing line, and that is because on the first lap in the first corner a couple of the cars may have dipped the wheels onto the grass on the inside of turn 1. Now, as they went across the grass, they would have pulled all the dirt and dust, and if they obviously went off into the gravel on the outside, they would have pulled all that back onto the circuit as they rejoined the track. Now, that is obviously going to reduce the grip, but here in the wet conditions, as the cars are driving around the circuit, basically that rain is starting to fall, and what they'll actually do is it will turn that dirt and dust into mud in wet conditions, as obviously wet, or shall I say water, mixing with dirt results in mud. So basically, if the conditions were completely dry, you would have that dirt build up there on the inside, and it would stay there fairly prominently and may continue to build up over time. Obviously, as the cars go over that dirt, they may actually kind of disperse the dirt that's there on the inside, wash it away, or basically pick it up and basically disperse it. But the water, or shall I say the rainfall, is also adding to that as well. So the rain falling onto the circuit is actually washing away some of that dirt, but in the same time it's actually turning it into mud, so it's making it more slippery. It also does that with the rubber buildup as well. So if we actually started with a dry session and we had a lot of dry running, and you get a lot of rubber buildup laid over time as the cars continue to drive around the circuit, and the rain actually starts to fall, the rain will actually wash away some of that rubber buildup, and some of the rubber buildup that actually remains will actually become more slippery, as obviously the water on the rubber is actually sitting on top of the rubber rather than actually sitting in the grooves of the circuit. So that is where you'll start to see basically the normal racing line becoming more slippery and having less grip than, say, having or driving off the racing line. So in those kind of conditions, that is when you want to basically try and deviate and search for other lines off of the normal traditional racing line, and basically just try and find ways around the track that may be quicker, may have more grip. Obviously in a session where it started off a lot wetter, there's going to be a lot less rubber build up to begin with. There will be some, because obviously the whole LiveTrack seeding system will have basically placed and simulated some of the rubber build-up. Likewise, if you had sessions prior to, say, your race session, so say you had a qualifying and a race, you did those, the rubber build-up from those will be carried over into your race session, and then basically the rubber will change from that. It will either get washed away, or some of the rubber that's like properly embedded in will become slippery, and it may be better to deviate from the racing line. So the rain is actually continuing to fall, and as it's doing so, it's basically saturating the track a lot more. You can see obviously the detail puddles that we talked about previously, and the track is looking nice and reflective. We have this area down here where you can see puddles are building up quite nicely, and those have been increasing. For those of you who are a little bit more basically eagle-eyed and have been keeping an eye on the size of those puddles, you would have seen them increasing over time. So the rain obviously falls onto the circuit, or shall I say the track environment. The track environment then obviously absorbs that water up to a point that it can't hold anymore. Obviously the surface, the tarmac of the track is going to be able to hold a lot less water than say the gravel traps or the grass will be able to, and therefore will obviously start to pull the water a lot more than the grass will do so. And you can see there's a little bit of a pooling of water on the grass just here, as you can see, and this little pool of water here actually feeds into this LiveTrack puddle that is actually forming on the circuit here. Now, something to note with this as well, as the cars are obviously continuing to drive around, they're actually moving the water around the circuit as they go with them. So if they were to, for instance, run wide and come over the curb here on the outside of turn 1 at the bottom of the hill, and actually go into this puddle here, they'll actually splash some of the water back onto the circuit. Now, as they obviously drive through the puddles, they also actually pull the water from the puddles as well. So for example, if this LiveTrack puddle here was to actually run across the full width of the track and the cars were running through that puddle, they'll be pulling the water up the hill slightly as they go through that puddle, and actually kind of just be dispersing the water around the surface of the track. You can see they're kind of forming a little bit of a drying line. It keeps kind of fading in and out. If actually, I'll stay at this camera angle so we can watch the cars come around the next time. You can see that the drying line that they had kind of formed has now pretty much mostly disappeared, as obviously the rain is continuing to fall. As the cars are coming around the circuit, they'll start to lift the water from the track. The amount of water that is lifted is purely basically dependent on the number of cars and then also the actual car type as well. The Formula Cs are pretty good lifting water. They've got fairly decent tyres, good grip, and they have pretty moderate downforce. So they're reasonably good at lifting some water. Obviously they're not as good as some of the more faster, the more high-end power cars. But as you'll see, once all the cars have actually gone through, there's a bit of a drying line that has started to form, because obviously the tyres are lifting the water off from the surface of the track. Now this drying line, as you can see, is relatively quickly actually fading because we've still got quite a bit of heavy rainfall. Now the actual rainfall itself is localized to the track, and basically what we have is a series of rain clouds that basically move across the track. They'll move in random directions. Obviously they are influenced by wind, but they will vary in size. They'll basically move in different directions. They can cross over each other, and basically they'll move around the track environment. Now underneath these rain clouds is basically where you'll find the rain fall down onto the circuit. So if you find an area of a track, particularly a large track, say such as Le Mans and Nordschleife, you may find some sections of the track actually don't get covered by these rain clouds. Therefore the rain doesn't actually fall down onto those sections of the track. So you find that you'll get localized weather, especially with a track like Nordschleife where it is so big. What you may find is actually half the circuit is actually very, very wet, similar to the conditions that we're seeing here. But the other half of the circuit may actually be dry, purely because none of the rain clouds has actually moved over that part of the circuit yet. Obviously, as the rain clouds move around the circuit, you'll get more rainfall in those areas. They do also overlap as well, so you may see like really quite heavy rainfall in some areas and then lighter rainfall in other areas. All that kind of thing obviously is influenced by the wind a little bit, but also it does kind of move in random directions and expand as well. Basically try to simulate the whole localized weather effect, which is really, really cool, and means that you won't really ever get any two wet weather sessions that are going to be exactly the same, as these rain clouds are going to start off in different places. They're going to move into different positions and obviously expand and shrink in size, and basically completely dynamically affects how water is built up around the circuit. Now, as you can see, these LiveTrack puddles are actually starting to get quite a bit bigger now compared to what they were previously at the beginning of the session. The rainfall should start to ease relatively soon as we start to go more towards the actual overcast conditions. Now, it seems like the rainfall is still actually quite heavy at this point in time, possibly because obviously we'll be underneath a rain cloud somewhere along in the system. We may actually have two rain clouds over us at the moment, considering the amount of rainfall that's actually falling. If we actually go ahead and move to another part of the circuit, we may actually see potentially a little bit of lighter rain. It seems like it's still quite heavy over here as well. But we shall go back over to this side and basically focus on the area of the circuit that we have been watching throughout the duration of the session. So you can see this continue to progress throughout this race session as the cars continue to go around. So that is obviously one of the things with the weather system, with the basically the localized weather. You'll start to see those kind of effects taking hold in the on the track, and once we actually get more towards basically the drier conditions, the way the track actually dries up as well is also affected by the weather. It's obviously going to be affected by the amount of sunlight that is actually falling onto the circuit. Is then also going to be affected by the temperatures, both ambient and also track temperature. So, for instance, basically a summer season with very clear conditions and very hot temperatures is going to dry the track and evaporate the water on the circuit much faster than a winter season where you're in overcast conditions and basically a much cooler temperatures. So temperature and the amount of sunlight is going to affect how quickly the track dries. It is then also going to be affected by the type of cars going around the circuit, and also how many cars are going around the circuit as well. Like I've been saying throughout the episode, the more cars that you have on the track, the more dirt build-up that you're going to have if they are going off track and coming back onto it. Obviously, the more cars that are doing that, the more dirt is going to be pulled back onto the track. Then also get basically more temperature and also rubber build up on the circuit as well. You can see a drying line is actually starting to become a little bit more prominent now. It's actually going to fade at a much slower rate here, as well as obviously the rain is now actually starting to ease. You can see that quite visibly. But that drying line will obviously start to form a lot more drastically with the cars going around the circuit, so they'll lift and clear the water much quicker. You can see that the LiveTrack is still continuing to tick over as water is still being fed into this LiveTrack puddle down here, so this is going to continue to grow even though the rain is starting to ease. Basically what you have is the water is basically falling from the higher points of the circuit and basically moving down into these lower points. Now, how quickly these LiveTrack puddles is obviously going to be affected by the weather as well, but also the track's drainage system. If every single track in the game has its own drainage system, and this basically affects where roughly where the LiveTrack puddles will build up, but also how quickly they'll disappear as well. Tracks with much better drainage systems will have a lot less water kind of build up. The water will basically flow away from the circuit at a much faster rate. So the rain is now pretty much stopped, as you can see, and as you'll witness and will continue to watch and monitor over time, obviously the cars are continuing to basically clear the water off of this drying line, And as you can see, in some places there's actually a little bit less spray coming up from the cars unless they go ahead and dip their wheels onto the wetter part of the track. So that was the final car that just went past there. If we take a look down at the surface of the track, you can see nice and wet over here on the right hand side of the circuit. And as we move back over to the left, it is looking very nice and dry on this drier part of the track. And as you can see, it's actually looking a little bit, if I can try and get the right angle to illustrate this a little bit better, the drying line is actually getting wider in the braking zone here for turn 2 at the top of the hill, because some of the cars are actually deviating from the more traditional racing line. As you can see, P2 there, that's just gone through, it's taken a slightly more tighter line, he's gone slightly more to the inside. There's this green car here as well, he's dipping the wheels onto the wetter parts of the track. And this is the kind of thing that you'll see, especially in terms of the difference between offline with driving with AI and then online with a multiplayer session as well. And some people actually commented in the previous video about this and asking what are the differences in terms of acceleration between online and offline racing. And the difference is, in the actual LiveTrack system, there are none. It entirely depends on where the cars are actually going around the track in terms of how quickly the track dries up and how quickly a drying line starts to form around the circuit. Now obviously with a single player session with AI, the AI tend to stick to the racing line a lot more. They don't really tend to deviate it from it too much. Obviously there is some amount of deviation, especially when overtaking and things like that. Some drivers do take slightly different lines than others, but generally they tend to drive within a much narrower window and tend to turn laps using exactly the same line a lot more consistency, and will consistently take the same line over and over again, lap after lap, in comparison to drivers or players playing in an online session. Obviously with human error and everything else like that, there's going to be various different lines that drivers will be taking. They may not take exactly this same line 100% of the time over the course of say 10 laps or something like that. There'll be a lot more deviation than comparison to the AI, which is why you'll see the drying line start to form a lot quicker in an offline session in comparison to an online session. Obviously with basically varying different player abilities and players taking different lines as well, you're going to see some more variation with that. Now obviously one of the things to note is obviously whether the AI is taking basically this 1 or 2 lines into this first turn here, you're going to see a much more narrower and more defined drying line coming in. In an online session where you got players taking all sorts of different lines and approaches up towards the second turn, the drying line probably isn't going to dry as quickly, it's not going to be as prominent or as narrow initially, but it's going to be much wider. Basically the whole LiveTrack system is dynamic, it's not scripted or anything else like that. It's all dynamically done entirely depending on the weather, the cars that are driving around the circuit and the lines that they're taking, the type of cars and things like that. And obviously in an online environment everything is so much more variable and going to be so much more dynamic that you'll probably you'll see less rapid advancement but more variance in things. So you can see now that these puddles are actually getting much bigger. Even though it has stopped raining, it's basically the water is falling from those higher points in the circuit and then coming down to these lower points and pooling. And you can see that the spray is also being flipped up by the cars as they're going through these wetter parts of the track. So if I come up here, you can see this kind of more dirty line that is starting to be put down onto the circuit as the cars coming across the start-finish line. They're obviously picking up dirt and dust somewhere along the line out the exit here. My car is now parked in the middle of the road. I've only just realised that. I should very quickly move him out the way. And leave him there. And hopefully it won't move and deviate back onto the racing line, and that, as you can see, where I've actually moved my car, the AI is now actually starting to take another line into this first turn. So where all this dirt and dust is actually coming from is the exit here. You can see that the drying line goes right up to the gravel on the outside, and you can actually see some of the gravel actually being pulled back onto the circuit here. These stones aren't usually here. This is all basically the drivers pulling this dirt and gravel back onto the circuit. I'll continue to go along. You can see it. I've actually pulled it quite a long way along this line. And you can see that dust build up on the outside there. Now, this is mainly going to be dust and gravel at this time. Obviously, where it's not continuing to rain, it's not really going to turn into mud as such in this instance, but you can see it gets much thinner as we come down towards turn 1. You can see a bit of rubber build-up actually starting to form as well. You can see the puddles are actually starting to eke across as well, across the full width of the track. And you've actually got a couple of darker patches here as well, where the water is basically continuing to run across the circuit. As you can see, there is a little bit of a kind of a tick rate to the whole LiveTrack system. It's not kind of like fully 100% real time in terms of smooth transitions. There is like a little tick every second or couple of seconds, but you can see that even though there's a bit of a drying line starting to form here, the cars are still flicking up spray as they are going across these two little miniature rivers that run across the circuit. So the cars actually pull the water around the track with them. If they go ahead and run wide into this puddle here on the exit, as I was saying, it will splash the water back onto the circuit, and it'll pull the water out from that puddle as well, and then pull them basically whatever line it chooses to take. So you can obviously see that the weather is starting to basically take effect. I'm going to start to see the weather system actually go more towards the heavy cloud, and you'll start to see the track actually start to dry out in terms of its saturation. These LiveTrack puddles are probably going to hang around for quite some time. It's going to take a while for those to dry out unless we start getting some really direct sunlight. But you'll start to see that the actual saturation of the circuit, so these like detail puddles and the reflectiveness here, start to dissipate, and it'll start to become a lot drier, and that drying line will be much less prominent. You'll start to see more of this rubber build-up that you can see here start to form a lot more prominently. And when the cars actually deviate, as I've been saying throughout the episode, start to deviate and onto the wetter parts of the track, they'll start to kick up more spray and things like that. So LiveTrack is really such a cool and powerful system, and I know that some people are probably going to ask this in the comment section, so I'll say it now. Yes, driving with wet tyres on a track in these kind of conditions where you've got this drying line, when your tyres do start to get warm, you can deviate from the drying line onto the wetter parts of the track to cool down your tyres. Now obviously the amount that it cools the tyres down by entirely depends on how wet the track is, basically how much time you actually spend in those wetter parts of the circuit. But just like in real life, you'll find that drivers who are still on the wet tyres when they've got this drying line starting to form, they'll deviate from the racing line, or shall I say the drier line of the circuit, onto the wetter parts of the track and actually basically try to cool down the tyres. That is also a feature in Project Cars 2. You can also do that with your tyres as well. So we are now starting to go more away from the overcast conditions. You can start to see the sky is starting to brighten up a little bit more. We're going to go more into the heavy cloud conditions, and you'll see track continuing to dry over time as well. Eventually at some point the AI drivers will pit for slick tyres as well. Now there's no real defining point exactly as to when is the best time to switch from a wet tyre onto a drier tyre in these kind of conditions. It entirely depends on how LiveTrack is actually basically evolving over time, how much of a dry line there is, how wide that drying line is as well, and then basically the amount of standing water and the general saturation of the circuit of the track surface as well. All those kind of things will basically should be factored into your decision as to when is it going to be the best time to switch onto the tyres, because although you may have like a nice dry line that is all the way around the circuit, as we have pretty much in this instance here, you've got a bit of water that is spreading across the track here and it's a little bit wetter. Also down into this area, into this corner here, and as we continue around, obviously you can see the drying line, you've got the grip, we've got the cars splashing through the puddle on the inside here, so that's obviously helping to clear the puddle somewhat, but it's also dragging the water and extending it further along, hence some of the slightly darker wet patch on the inside here is really quite difficult to pick up. Obviously you can see the rubber build-up, but it's still quite wet in this area as well. That's because they're pulling the water from this puddle and then pulling it along across the circuit as well. But yeah, even though there may be a decent drying line that has formed all the way around the length of the circuit, obviously if that's very, very narrow and you go ahead and make the mistake and deviate from that drying line and go down onto the wet stuff and you're on a slick tyre, you could end up finding yourself in a bit of trouble, as obviously a slick tyre on a wet track surface isn't that great. There isn't going to be all that much grip. So we're now basically going into pretty much near enough the full-on heavy cloud conditions. So you'll start to see the track drying up a lot quicker. So yeah, it's difficult here. Here we go. We've just had a car that's gone wide on the exit of this turn. It's actually going to splash some of the water back onto the circuit, onto this line here that you can see. Now if we actually watch it from this angle, you can actually see quite nicely where the wetter parts of the track are. You can see the water is actually starting to spread as well. Like I was saying, it's not completely updated in live real time. You can see it kind of ticking and working its way across there in stages, but what you actually see is when the cars actually come through this, they'll kick up the spray, they're clearing the water, as you can see there, lifting it from the circuit and actually starting to form that drying line a little bit better and clearing the water from the track there. And this is all completely dynamic. That's all done by the cars basically driving over that area, and obviously the weather having an impact as well. So this is kind of, yeah, the LiveTrack system, how it will evolve over time. Obviously it's all completely dynamic. It's entirely dependent on the weather and what the cars are doing around the track and everything else like that. So it's a very, very cool, powerful, dynamic system. It means that a lot of the races that you'll do won't be exactly the same, even though you're using the same conditions. No wet race is going to be exactly the same as another. The track is going to evolve in a different way entirely depending on the temperatures, what the cars are doing. Obviously if you go ahead and if you're doing online multiplayer races, that's all going to have an impact as well. It's going to be much more dynamic in that area because obviously the cars are deviating from their lines a lot more, as obviously players aren't 100% consistent with each other. They don't take exactly the same line and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully this has been more eye-opening to you guys as to how powerful the LiveTrack system actually is and how dynamic the LiveTrack system actually is. And it's not a static stuff that you'll find in a lot of games as of late, as of previous, and it's much more realistic, and yeah, probably goes a lot deeper than you actually thought. So hopefully this has been very, very insightful. Obviously if you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave those down in the comment section below. I'll try and get back to you as soon as I possibly can. If you're enjoying this content, then please consider subscribing to the channel, like the video, share it with friends and other fellow racers, as obviously supporting the channel and spreading the knowledge to other guys is obviously very, very useful in helping them basically understand how the LiveTrack system actually works. And you can see here now the track is actually starting to dry a lot more. You're not seeing these large detailed puddles quite so heavily prominent on the right hand side of the circuit, and obviously it's looking a lot drier in general and a lot less reflective. So this has been basically a look at LiveTrack in action. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and hopefully I shall catch you in the next episode. But in the meantime, have fun and take care.